If HTML is the structural skeleton of our website, CSS, which stands for Cascading Style Sheets, is the skin, clothing, and armor. Without CSS, the browser applies its own boring default rules like black Times New Roman text and everything stacked vertically on a white background. CSS allows us to target specific HTML elements and change their presentation rules, things like colors, fonts, borders, and spacing. A CSS rule consists of a selector, which tells the browser what to look for, and a block of declarations, which tell the browser what to change. We're going to learn about all three selector types and make some changes to our page that will transform it almost immediately. As you can see, I've already added a CSS file. Sometimes, especially in beginner projects, you'll see this called styles.css, and you may see it right next to the primary HTML file right here at the root of your project. However, since you'll be moving toward having a larger code base eventually anyway, I wanted to show you how you might find this structured in a project with additional files and folders. So inside my public folder, you see I now have images and styles. Inside the styles folder, you find main.css. For now, we're just going to use the one CSS file to handle all of our global styling, the styling for our hero dashboard, the bounty board, which you are going to be responsible for changing, and then eventually we'll talk about media queries where we can add some breakpoints to handle responsive styling. Let's start at the top. The first type of selector we want to define is an element selector. That simply means that you are going to be defining styles for existing elements corresponding to these tags you see here in your HTML. We're going to start with body. Everything inside the body will inherit these styles unless we override them later at a more localized point. So let's go ahead and do that here. I'll start by naming the element, and then I'm going to open up the declaration block. Everything we define here is a series of key value pairs. I'll start with background color, and I'll change it to 1A1A24. Now this is a hex color system, and VS Code has this built-in feature where you can come up and actually move this around if you want to. You can change the color space if you want to work with some of the other many systems out there. The most common are RGB and hex. I am mostly going to be using hex, but we will look at RGB a couple times as we unpack this. You can see we have a nice dark charcoal gray to start, but now that makes our text pretty unreadable. So let's go ahead and keep going. I'll change the color, which refers to the font color, and make that E to E8, F0. Notice that each of these key value pairs is separated with semicolons. That's very important. The last one I want to do is to change the font family so that we're no longer dealing with the default Times New Roman. So I'll use font family, colon. And you'll notice that VS Code immediately is presenting me with a lot of font families that are common to browsers everywhere. If you use these, you can be pretty sure that it will be interpreted the way you want without you having to load in a very specific font. So for now, let's just choose this fifth one here. Cap it off with a semicolon. And what this means is it will always try to load this one first, but if it can't find that one for some reason, it'll use the next one on the list as a backup, and so on and so forth until it gets to the very generic sans serif, which is just a name for all of these types of fonts. Okay, so we already see how much our page has changed by changing the background color, the color of the text, and the font. Let's move to the next one. We're going to do another element selector, this time affecting just the header. So I'll access the header element. Remember, this corresponds directly to this specific semantic element here. Let's start with background color. This one I'm going to make 2D, 2D, 3D. The next one will be the padding. So this is actually the interior space. So if we take a look at this, we can see we have the background color making it clear what the box of this header is. And the contents of it now have a little bit of padding around it on the top and the bottom and the left and the right. And it looks like there's additional padding on the top or the bottom, but that's because an H1 element already has some margin applied to it that's adding to that space on the top and the bottom. We're going to look later at how to fix that. Let's keep going here. I'm going to add a bottom border. So we say border dash bottom when we want to affect only the bottom and not the border on all four sides. And you need to give it 3 values here. The width in pixels, 3 pixels, the fact that it is solid as opposed to dashed or dotted, and then the color, of course, which I'm going to use 4DA6FF to give us a nice bright blue here. And we see that is in fact applied only on the bottom. The next thing we're going to do is to change the color of our H2 elements. Right now, the only places we're using that are here for hero dashboard and here for local bounties. Right here, we can say that we want to change styling for the H2 element, and this will apply it to any H2 that it finds within the page, unless we overwrite it later in a more specific location, which we will be doing. And now I'm going to use that same blue. Notice that VS Code recognizes I've already used it once, so I'm just going to use my down arrow there to select it and hit tab for it to complete it. And we see that both of our H2s now have that same blue. So those are the element selectors. You just choose the name of the built-in element, open up a declaration block, and give it values for each of the properties you want to affect. Let's talk now about the class level element. The idea behind classes is that you can define something and then apply it selectively to only certain elements in your file, but it's reusable. The way you define it is to use a dot and then use hyphenated lowercase for highlight list. Now I open up the declaration block, add the background color. And this one, I'm going to start by using the color white, which is something that's built in by name. However, I want to have a little bit of transparency to it. So if I click on this and come up into here, you'll notice I can choose to make it RGB. And then I can add one more value by including an alpha channel. So I'll say A, and then here, add a fourth value of 0.05. Now that means 5% because opacity is always measured out of 1. Now we haven't applied this class yet, so you're not going to see it change anything here. But we can start doing that now. We can switch over to our HTML and notice here, I've got a note that we need to wrap this entire section in a div and apply our class. So I'll create a div, and for classes, we need to actually use the attribute class and then in quotes, give the name of the class. And notice when I do that, I'm not using the dot that I used when I was defining it. This represents a class for the definition, but in order to say that it's a class in the HTML file, we just use the attribute name class with the name only in quotes. So I've opened that up, but I need to actually move these elements inside so that they're nested inside the div. And as soon as I do that, you'll see that we have this highlighted area here around current equipment with the list of sword and shield and potion. So let's keep making changes to that. You'll notice that right now the text is right up against the edges of the box because there's no padding. So let's add some things. I'm going to change the padding, and this time I'm going to give 3 values. The first one represents the padding just at the top. The next one is going to represent the left and right values. And then the last one will change just the bottom value. And it still looks a little bit off because of this heading right here, but we're going to fix that in a minute using a more global approach. I'll also add a border radius, which makes it a rounded rectangle of 5 pixels. It's very subtle. It might be hard for you to see, but right there, the edges are rounded. And then I'm also going to give it a margin of 1 EM, which refers to exactly 100% of the size of the font at this location, whatever is inherited if it hasn't been specified here. These types of measurements have been preferred in modern times because if you change the font size, everything else adjusts and gives you a consistent, proportionate look to your page. Okay, so we're going to leave that alone for now. We'll make some adjustments in a minute here that's going to improve the way this padding looks. Now, I have a lot of different demo comments for myself here, and if you ever have so many that you're having trouble finding where they all are, you can come over to the global search of all your files, start typing in what it is you're looking for. And in this case, if I want to see all of the ones that are number 1, I can narrow it down and find them. We just finished with D and with E because we actually applied this class to this entire section. So that means we're on to F. So this is where it's time to talk about the third type of selector, the ID selector. You may recall that we had already applied an ID to this entire section for the hero dashboard. I'm going to make use of that by providing a CSS definition for the entire section using this ID, and that's how it'll know how to find it. So if a class uses a dot, an ID uses a hashtag. And I'll go ahead and give it the same name that already exists, hero dashboard. Then open up my declaration block. And I'm going to add a background color. And I'm going to use the color 242433. Add padding of 20 pixels. Notice this changing as I add each of these new properties. And then I'm going to give it a border that is 2 pixels solid with the hex code 485568. All right, so we can see now that this section has this border around it. It has the padding to where the text is not up against the left side anymore, and it has a background color that is similar to the one in the header. But we have some things happening that is making it hard for us to be consistent with the different types of elements we have and to understand the difference between the padding and the margin at different points. One of the ways that we can explore this is by looking here. You'll notice that the hero dashboard section has this padding of 20 pixels, which is in that white box down there. I know it's very small and you probably can't read it, but if you explore this for yourself, you'll be able to read it on your own screen. We also have places where we can see both padding and margin. So in this case, the highlight list class gave us top and side padding, bottom padding of only 5 pixels, and then a bottom margin of 16 pixels, which altogether creates that space between this section and the text below it. But the text itself even comes with some built-in margin on the top and the bottom because paragraphs are treated a little bit like a block element. On the other hand, we have this little span over here. A span is an element that's used as a wrapper, primarily if you want to be able to apply some sort of styling or class to it without affecting its layout. But you'll notice that means it's just forcing it up against this image, and this isn't really how we want to do this ultimately, but we're going to fix that later with some other styling approaches. For now, let's just take care of standardizing our padding and our margins so that we can control them the way we really want to. The way we do this is to go all the way to the top, and even before we get to the body level, we're just going to say asterisk, which is a wildcard for everything. And we're going to add a margin of 0 and a padding of 0 to essentially reset everything and override whatever it would naturally do by applying it to everything. But I also want to add one more. Box sizing, border box. We won't see the evidence of this right away, but what this essentially does is make sure that if we're going to do math later by changing the padding and also using measurements like 100% or 80%, it makes sure that everything actually makes sense with the math so that it subtracts or adds things without making it run off the edge of the page. It's going to force it to treat the width of the entire viewport as the 100%. So in general, it's just always a good idea to apply this at the top level so that you don't have to worry about messing with the math later. So now we see that because we have changed the margin and padding, everything is crammed up against everything else. So this is where we actually need to go back and say, okay, I want to make some adjustments to certain selectors so that we can control what it looks like, but in a very consistent way. Instead of having various default values being applied behind the scenes where it's harder to track what's going on, this allows us to be very intentional and explicit with defining these styles. So right here, I'm going to list out several selectors, P, H2, H3, H4, and image. And for all of these, we can apply this at the same time, margin bottom 1em, which again is the size of your font. And that already improves things by adding some spacing between some things, right? The other one I want to do though is the UL for unordered list. And we'll make sure that we have a margin bottom of 1em, but also have some padding on the left so that it puts it back where it's supposed to be and indents it here nicely while still observing the padding. So that takes care of everything that I wanted to do for this particular demo, just to introduce you to a lot of the basic selectors, like element selectors, class selectors, and ID selectors, to show how they apply to the different elements in our HTML file. And then, of course, how we're able to actually see them play out in the browser. For the practice, you're going to pick up where I left off. You'll have some to-dos, which you can search here like this, to-do number 1, and then it'll show you A, B, and C. So you're going to work with this aside element that you can see here with the ID of Bounty Board, and you're going to change the background color, add an alpha channel with a opacity of 10%, add padding, add a border, and I've given you the instructions here with specific values you need to use. Here, you're going to override the H2 so that instead of it taking this value of blue that we defined in the global CSS, you're going to apply a more local styling. And something that's not here in the comments, so I'll give you a little bit of a hint, is that when you are creating this definition and you're saying, I want to go to the H2 within Bounty Board, the way you do that is to first give the ID and then say H2 specifically. And what that tells the browser is that you want to change the value for the H2, but only the one that's nested within the Bounty Board and not any other H2. So this is how you're going to want to set that up. Your last one, C, is to make sure that you wrap these elements in a div that applies that same highlight class list that we applied to this div here, so that this section down here with the bounty requirements will have the same styling that you see up here for the current equipment. By the time you're done, you're going to have something that looks very similar in layout, nice and clean with good padding and margins, but it'll have a slightly different color theme, which will make it visually interesting. Eventually, we're going to have it where these two sections are side by side, but we'll get to that in a future demo. That's all I've got for you in this one. I will see you in the next one.